My daughter got married, and to my sorrow, she coldly told me, "Stay away from us." I accepted in silence, never imagining that life had something unexpected in store. The surprise that happened afterward made her cry in a way she had never cried before. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Riverside Country Club, its light reflecting off champagne glasses and designer jewelry. Lucia Santos stood near the entrance, her weathered hands smoothing down the navy blue dress she had bought specifically for this occasion, the most expensive piece of clothing she had ever owned. At 62, she felt every one of her years as she watched the elegant crowd mingle effortlessly, their laughter ringing with the confidence that comes from never having to count pennies. Her daughter Marina moved through the crowd like a swan gliding across a pristine lake. At 28, Marina had transformed herself so completely that sometimes Lucia wondered if she was looking at a stranger. Gone was the girl who used to help sort recyclables in their tiny apartment kitchen. In her place stood a poised young woman in a designer gown that probably cost more than Lucia's monthly rent. Her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, her engagement ring catching the light with every gesture. Lucia had arrived early, hoping to find a quiet moment with Marina before the festivities began in earnest. She had something special to give her, a delicate gold locket that had belonged to Lucia's mother, Marina's grandmother. It was one of the few valuable things the family had ever owned, passed down through 3 generations of women who had known hardship but never lost their dignity. "Marina, mia figlia," Lucia called softly as her daughter swept past, surrounded by a group of impeccably dressed women who spoke in the polished tones of the upper class. Marina's smile faltered for just a moment when she saw her mother approaching. The women around her, future in-laws and society friends, turned their curious gazes toward Lucia, taking in her department store dress and sensible shoes with barely concealed assessment. "Mother," Marina said, her voice carefully controlled, "I didn't expect you so early." There was something in her tone that made Lucia's heart skip uncomfortably. She had raised Marina alone after her husband abandoned them when Marina was just 5 years old. Through double shifts cleaning office buildings and weekend work at a local restaurant, Lucia had scraped together enough money for Marina's education, sacrificing her own needs so her daughter could have opportunities she never had. "I wanted to give you something," Lucia said, reaching into her small purse to retrieve the antique jewelry box. "This belonged to your grandmother. I've been saving it for your wedding day, but I thought—" "Oh," Marina interrupted, glancing nervously at the women surrounding them. That's very thoughtful, Mother. But perhaps we could do this later, in private?" The rejection was subtle but unmistakable. Lucia felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, of being seen as an embarrassment. She noticed how Marina's eyes darted toward her future mother-in-law, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, whose lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Of course," Lucia whispered, clutching the jewelry box tighter. "I understand." But she didn't understand. Not really. How had the little girl who used to curl up in Lucia's lap, begging for stories about their family's history, become someone who was ashamed of that very same history? The evening progressed with Lucia relegated to the margins, watching from afar as Marina basked in attention from relatives and friends she had never mentioned during their increasingly infrequent phone calls. When Marina's fiancé, James Whitmore Jr., stood to make a toast, Lucia found herself pressed against the back wall, invisible among the waitstaff. "To Marina," James said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. "The most amazing woman I've ever met. Beautiful, intelligent, and with the grace that can only come from good breeding." Good breeding. The words hit Lucia like a physical blow. She watched Marina beam at the compliment, accepting the applause of the crowd without a single glance in her mother's direction. As the evening wore on, Lucia made several more attempts to approach her daughter, each time being gently but firmly redirected. When she finally managed to catch Marina alone near the ladies' room, she tried once more to present the locket. "Marina, please. This is important to me. Your grandmother would have wanted—" "Mother, stop!" Marina's voice was sharp, cutting through Lucia's words like a blade. She glanced around nervously, ensuring they were alone. "You have to understand, this isn't the time or place. These people, they're James's family, his friends. They're important to our future, and I'm not? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken tensions. Marina's face softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. That's not what I'm saying. But you have to see how this looks. You don't? You don't fit in here, Mother. And I've worked so hard to build this life, to become someone who belongs in James's world. I can't have anything jeopardize that. The words were a dagger to Lucia's heart, but what hurt most was the shame in her daughter's eyes. Marina was ashamed of her, of the woman who had given up everything to ensure her daughter could reach for the stars. I see, Lucia said quietly, her voice barely audible over the music drifting from the main hall. And what about the wedding? Am I invited to that? Marina's silence was answer enough. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully measured, as if she had rehearsed them. I think it would be best if you gave me some space, Mother. James and I are building a new life together, and we need to focus on our future. Maybe it's time for both of us to move forward separately. The dismissal was final, wrapped in the language of mutual benefit, but unmistakably clear. Lucia nodded slowly, her heart breaking with each breath. I understand, she said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. I'll go now. She pressed the jewelry box into Marina's reluctant hands. This is still yours. It's your heritage, whether you want it or not. As Lucia walked away, her sensible shoes clicking against the marble floor with quiet dignity, she didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see if Marina watched her leave or simply returned to her glamorous new life without a second thought. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Lucia's modest apartment as she sat in her worn armchair, staring at the space on her mantel where a photo of Marina used to sit. She had taken it down after the engagement party 3 months ago, unable to bear the daily reminder of her daughter's rejection. The silence in the apartment was deafening. No phone calls, no visits, no acknowledgement of her existence in Marina's new world. Lucia had always known this day might come. From the moment Marina received her scholarship to the prestigious university, from her first internship at the law firm where she met James, Lucia had watched her daughter drift further and further away from their humble beginnings. What she hadn't expected was the complete severance, the surgical precision with which Marina had excised her mother from her life. The mail slot rattled, interrupting her brooding thoughts. Lucia rose stiffly from her chair, her knees protesting after hours of stillness. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an official-looking envelope bearing the letterhead of Pemberton Walsh and Associates, a law firm she didn't recognize. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, expecting perhaps another notice about overdue bills or insurance matters. Instead, she found herself staring at words that made no sense, sentences that seemed to belong in someone else's life entirely. Dear Mrs. Santos, the letter began, we regret to inform you of the passing of your aunt, Miss Isabella Santos Morrison, who died peacefully in her home in Portugal on September 15th. As per her last will and testament, you have been named as her sole beneficiary. Lucia sank back into her chair, the letter fluttering in her shaking hands. Aunt Isabella. She had only the vaguest memories of her father's sister, who had left Brazil for Portugal when Lucia was just a child. There had been a few letters over the years, Christmas cards with foreign stamps, but eventually even those had stopped coming. Lucia had assumed Isabella had forgotten about the family entirely, or perhaps had passed away years ago. She forced herself to focus on the legal language, trying to parse the formal terminology. Words and phrases jumped out at her: substantial estate, various properties, investment portfolio, liquid assets totaling. The number that followed made her gasp aloud. It was more money than she had ever imagined existing, let alone belonging to someone she barely remembered. $7 million. The sum was so large it seemed abstract, meaningless. Lucia had spent her entire life counting every penny, working multiple jobs to afford basic necessities, sacrificing her own needs so Marina could have a better future. And now, through a quirk of genetics and an aunt's generosity, she was wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. The irony was not lost on her. Marina had rejected her for being an embarrassment, a reminder of humble origins that didn't fit into her new life of privilege. Now, Lucia possessed more wealth than the Whitmores could probably comprehend, certainly more than Marina's new husband could ever dream of earning in his lifetime. For a moment, Lucia allowed herself to imagine Marina's reaction. The shock, the regret, perhaps even the desperate attempts to reconcile once the truth came out. She could see herself arriving at Marina's wedding uninvited, dressed in designer clothes, making a grand gesture that would force her daughter to acknowledge her worth. The fantasy was sweet, tinged with the satisfaction of vindication. But as the initial shock wore off, a different emotion took its place. Sadness, deep and profound, settled over her like a heavy blanket. What good was wealth without someone to share it with? What meaning did money have when the person she loved most in the world had already decided she wasn't worth knowing? Lucia spent the rest of that rainy afternoon reading and rereading the letter, researching the law firm online, and slowly accepting the reality of her situation. By evening, she had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She would not tell Marina about the inheritance. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Her daughter had made her choice based on shame and social climbing, not out of any genuine assessment of worth or character. If Marina could only see value in money and status, then she wasn't ready to understand the true meaning of family. Instead, Lucia began to plan. For the first time in her life, she had the power to make a real difference in the world, to create the kind of legacy that money alone could never buy. Marina had taught her a valuable lesson at that engagement party. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes dignity requires walking away. But dignity didn't mean bitterness. As Lucia sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions that represented a lifetime of struggle, she began to envision a different kind of future. One where Isabella's unexpected gift could honor the family values that Marina had chosen to abandon. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the streets clean, carrying away the dust and debris of the day. Inside, Lucia Santos, newly wealthy but still fundamentally unchanged, began to plan for a tomorrow that would surprise everyone, most of all herself. 6 weeks after receiving the inheritance letter, Lucia found herself sitting in the gleaming conference room of Hope for Tomorrow Foundation, surrounded by social workers, administrators, and philanthropists whose combined efforts had been hampered for years by inadequate funding. The foundation focused on providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, a cause that resonated deeply with someone who had worked multiple jobs to put her own daughter through school. "Mrs. Santos," said Dr. Patricia Mendez, the foundation's director, "I have to say, when your lawyer contacted us about this donation, we thought it might be some kind of mistake. $5 million it's transformational for an organization our size." Lucia nodded quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had chosen to donate the bulk of Isabella's inheritance, keeping only enough to ensure her own modest security. The decision had felt right the moment she made it, a way to honor not just her aunt's memory, but the values that had guided her throughout her life. "I want the money to go directly to scholarships," Lucia said, her voice steady, despite the surreal nature of the conversation. "Full scholarships, including living expenses for children whose parents are working multiple jobs just to survive." "I know what that's like." The room fell silent. These people were accustomed to dealing with wealthy donors who made charitable contributions for tax benefits or social recognition. But there was something different about the woman sitting before them. Lucia Santos wore a simple dress from a department store, carried a worn purse, and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived the struggles she was now trying to alleviate. That's remarkable," Dr. Mendez said finally. "With this donation, we could fund full scholarships for nearly 200 students. But Mrs. Santos, a donation of this magnitude typically comes with certain acknowledgments. Naming rights, perhaps? A gala in your honor?" "No." Lucia's response was immediate and firm. "I want this to be anonymous. Completely anonymous. The children who receive these scholarships should never feel burdened by gratitude to me personally. They should simply have the opportunity to learn, to grow, to become whatever they're capable of becoming." Dr. Mendez exchanged glances with her colleagues. In 30 years of fundraising, she had never encountered a donor who insisted on complete anonymity for such a substantial gift. Most philanthropists, however well-intentioned, wanted some form of recognition for their generosity. "Are you certain?" Dr. Mendez asked. "This level of giving, it deserves recognition. It could inspire others to contribute as well." I'm certain, Lucia replied. But I do have one condition. I want regular reports on the scholarship recipients. Not their names, I respect their privacy, but I want to know how they're doing, what they're studying, how the money is helping them build better lives. As the meeting concluded and paperwork was signed, Lucia felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. This was what wealth should do: create opportunities, lift people up, provide the kind of chances she had fought so hard to give Marina. The irony that Marina would never know about any of it was both painful and oddly satisfying. Over the following months, Lucia threw herself into quiet philanthropy with the same determination she had once applied to working double shifts. The Hope for Tomorrow Foundation was just the beginning. She researched dozens of organizations, visited food banks and homeless shelters, and carefully selected causes that aligned with her values and experience. To the women's shelter where she volunteered on weekends, she donated $500,000 to expand their job training programs. To the community health clinic in her old neighborhood, she provided funding for a new dental program, knowing how many families went without basic oral care simply because they couldn't afford it. Each donation was made anonymously, through layers of legal arrangements that ensured her identity remained hidden. The lawyer handling her affairs, Michael Torres, had initially tried to dissuade her from such extensive giving. "Mrs. Santos," he had said during one of their meetings, "while your generosity is admirable, you should consider keeping more for yourself. Perhaps invest in real estate, secure your retirement more substantially." But Lucia had been adamant. She kept enough money to ensure she would never be a burden to anyone, could afford good health care, and could live comfortably in her modest apartment. Beyond that, she felt no desire for luxury or extravagance. The money meant nothing to her personally. It was simply a tool to help others achieve what Marina had achieved, hopefully without losing their humanity in the process. During this time, Lucia received no communication from her daughter. She knew from mutual acquaintances that Marina's wedding had been held at the Whitmore family estate, a lavish affair that had been featured in the society pages of the local newspaper. Lucia had not seen the coverage directly. She had asked her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to hide the newspaper that day. But she had heard that Marina looked radiant, every inch the perfect society bride. The absence of her daughter was a constant ache, like a phantom limb that still sent signals of pain long after amputation. But Lucia had learned to live with it, to find meaning in the lives she was quietly transforming rather than dwelling on the relationship she had lost. One particularly meaningful project involved partnering with a community college to create a program for adult learners, people like herself who had never had the chance to pursue higher education when they were young. The Second Chances program, as it came to be known, provided not just tuition assistance but also childcare and transportation support, removing the barriers that kept working adults from improving their situations. "The woman behind this donation," the college president told a local reporter, "insists on complete anonymity, but I can tell you that she understands these challenges from personal experience. This isn't charity born from guilt or social obligation. This is someone who knows exactly what it means to have dreams deferred." Nearly a year after the inheritance, Lucia was volunteering at a community center's literacy program when she encountered someone who made her heart skip. A young woman about Marina's age was struggling to help her elementary school-aged son with his homework, clearly embarrassed by her own educational limitations. "I'm sorry," the woman said, tears threatening to spill. I never finished high school. I had my son young, and I've been working 2 jobs ever since. I want to help him, but I don't know how." Without hesitation, Lucia sat down beside them. "Let me help," she said gently. "What are you working on?" For the next hour, she patiently guided both mother and son through the math problems, sharing techniques she had learned during her own struggles to help Marina with homework years ago. As they worked, the woman, whose name was Carmen, shared her story. Single mother, working at a fast food restaurant and cleaning offices at night, dreaming of getting her GED but never having time or energy to pursue it. "You know," Lucia said carefully, "there are programs that can help with that. Scholarships for adult learners, support for childcare while you study. Would you like me to look into it for you?" Carmen's eyes widened. "You would do that, but why? You don't even know me." "Sometimes," Lucia said, thinking of Marina, Helping someone else's child is the only way to honor your own. A week later, Lucia had used her connections at the college to ensure Carmen received a full scholarship to the GED program, along with support services that would allow her to attend classes. Carmen never knew the extent of Lucia's involvement, believing she had simply been lucky enough to qualify for a needs-based scholarship. These encounters became more common as Lucia immersed herself deeper into community work. She was careful never to reveal her financial circumstances, always presenting herself as simply another volunteer who happened to have good connections. But privately, she continued to orchestrate support for the people she met, creating opportunities and removing obstacles with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood both struggle and the power of well-directed resources. Marina's marriage, which had begun with such promise and fanfare, began to show signs of strain by its first anniversary. The Whitmore family's expectations were suffocating: constant social obligations, rigid behavioral standards, and an assumption that Marina would abandon any career ambitions to focus on being the perfect wife and eventual mother. At the law firm, where she had once been a rising star, Marina found herself increasingly sidelined. Partners who had once praised her work now made subtle comments about her divided loyalties and questioned whether someone with a family to think about should take on high-stakes cases. Her husband James, who had initially supported her career, began echoing his family's expectations that she should prioritize what really matters. The isolation was profound. The friends Marina had cultivated in James's social circle were pleasant but superficial, relationships built on shared social status rather than genuine connection. Her old friends from law school had gradually fallen away, alienated by Marina's transformation and her obvious embarrassment about her background. In quiet moments, usually late at night when James was traveling for business, Marina found herself thinking about her mother. She would remember Lucia's worn hands as she worked on Marina's school projects, the way she would save for weeks to buy Marina a book she wanted, the pride in her eyes when Marina graduated from law school. The memory of their last conversation, Marina's harsh words about not fitting in, filled her with a shame that she tried to suppress but couldn't entirely escape. One evening, feeling particularly lonely, Marina picked up the phone to call her mother. She dialed the familiar number and listened to it ring once, twice, 3 times. When she heard Lucia's voice say hello, Marina opened her mouth to speak, then froze. What would she say? How could she explain that her perfect life felt hollow, that all the status and wealth she had prioritized couldn't fill the hole left by her mother's absence? Instead, Marina hung up without speaking, leaving Lucia listening to the dial tone and wondering if the call had been a mistake. The incident left both women shaken. Lucia spent hours wondering if it had been Marina on the phone, while Marina felt like a coward for not having the courage to bridge the gap she had created. But neither made another attempt to reach out, pride and hurt feelings creating a barrier that seemed impossible to cross. 2 years after inheriting Isabella's fortune, Lucia had settled into a rhythm of quiet philanthropy that gave her life meaning and purpose. She had personally funded the education of over 300 students, supported dozens of small community organizations, and helped countless individuals like Carmen achieve goals they had never thought possible. The work was deeply satisfying, even if it could never completely fill the void left by Marina's absence. On a crisp October morning, Lucia was reviewing quarterly reports from the various foundations she supported when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Mrs. Santos? The voice was professional, slightly nervous. This is Jennifer Walsh from the Channel 7 news team. I'm working on a story about anonymous philanthropy in our community, and your name has come up repeatedly as someone who might be able to provide some insights. Lucia's blood ran cold. She had been so careful to maintain her anonymity, working through lawyers and intermediaries to ensure her donations could never be traced back to her. I'm not sure what you mean, she said carefully. Well, that's just it, Jennifer continued. We've been investigating this remarkable pattern of donations over the past 2 years. Millions of dollars going to local charities and educational programs, all from anonymous sources, all processed through the same legal firm. We're calling it the Angel of the City story, someone who's quietly transformed dozens of organizations without seeking any recognition. That sounds like a wonderful story, Lucia managed. But I really don't see how I can help you. The thing is, Mrs. Santos, several people we've interviewed mentioned you specifically, not as the donor. They were very clear about that, but as someone who seems to have remarkable connections, someone who always knows exactly which programs might be able to help people in need. Carmen Rodriguez, for instance. She's now studying to be a nurse thanks to a scholarship she received after meeting you at the community center. Lucia closed her eyes, realizing how her desire to stay personally involved in the lives she was touching had created a trail that a determined reporter could follow. I just try to help when I can, she said quietly. Mrs. Santos, I want to be clear. We're not trying to expose anyone who doesn't want to be exposed. This story is about the impact of generosity, not about violating someone's privacy. But I think our viewers would be inspired to know that such kindness exists in our community. After ending the call, Lucia sat in her kitchen, staring at the report spread across her small table. She had always known that complete anonymity might be impossible to maintain forever, but she had hoped to keep her secret longer. The thought of public recognition made her deeply uncomfortable. She had never sought attention, and the idea of being celebrated felt wrong somehow. But more troubling was the possibility that Marina might see the story. How would her daughter react to learning that her embarrassing mother was actually wealthy beyond anything the Whitmores could imagine? Would Marina come running back, motivated by money rather than love? The thought filled Lucia with sadness rather than anticipation. Meanwhile, across town, Marina was dealing with her own crisis. Her marriage had deteriorated steadily over the past year, with James becoming increasingly controlling and dismissive. The final straw had come the previous week when he had publicly contradicted her during a dinner party, telling their guests that Marina's emotional nature made her unsuitable for serious legal work. The law firm had made it clear that her career prospects were limited as long as she remained married to James. The partners, while too diplomatic to say so directly, obviously viewed her as a social asset rather than a serious attorney. Her billable hours had been steadily reduced, and she had been passed over for partnership track positions twice in the past 6 months. Sitting in her perfectly decorated but emotionally sterile home, Marina found herself thinking more and more about her mother. She remembered how Lucia had worked multiple jobs to pay for Marina's education, how she had celebrated every small achievement, how she had believed in Marina's potential even when Marina didn't believe in herself. The guilt was becoming overwhelming. Marina had traded her mother's unconditional love for social status and wealth, only to discover that the status was hollow and the wealth came with chains she hadn't recognized until it was too late. The Channel 7 news story aired on a Thursday evening in November. Jennifer Walsh had crafted a respectful piece about anonymous philanthropy in the community, focusing on the impact rather than trying to expose the donor's identity. However, she had included interviews with several scholarship recipients and community leaders who inadvertently painted a picture that would be recognizable to anyone who knew Lucia well. "There's this woman," Carmen Rodriguez said in her interview, now clearly thriving in her nursing program. "She volunteers at the community center and she sees people, really sees them. She helped me find resources I never knew existed. I don't know if she's connected to the scholarship somehow, but I know she changed my life just by caring." The report featured similar testimonials from a dozen people whose lives had been transformed by anonymous donations that had come after chance. Encounters with a quiet, dignified woman who seemed to have remarkable connections to helpful resources. Marina watched the story while James was out of town on business, something stirring in her chest as she recognized the descriptions of a woman who sounded remarkably like her mother. Could it be possible? The woman in the testimonials was described as someone in her 60s, soft-spoken but determined, someone who understood struggle from personal experience. But surely it couldn't be Lucia. Her mother lived in a modest apartment, had worked service jobs her entire life. Where would she get the connections to help so many people access scholarships and services? The doubt gnawed at Marina through the weekend. On Monday, acting on an impulse she couldn't quite explain, She drove to her mother's neighborhood for the first time in over 2 years. She didn't plan to make contact. She wasn't ready for that conversation. She just wanted to see. To reassure herself that her mother was still living the same modest life, that the similarities in the news story were just coincidental. What she found confused her even more. Lucia looked well, better than she had in years, actually. Her clothes were still simple, but appeared to be of better quality. She moved with a confidence and sense of purpose that Marina didn't remember. Most telling, when Marina watched her mother leave the apartment building, she didn't head toward the bus stop as she always had. Instead, she walked to a late-model sedan that, while not luxurious, was certainly a significant upgrade from the 20-year-old car Lucia had been driving the last time Marina had paid attention. Marina sat in her car for nearly an hour, processing what she had observed. Something had changed in her mother's life, something significant. The timing aligned too perfectly with the news story to be coincidental. That evening, Marina found herself doing something she would have considered beneath her dignity just a few years earlier, researching her mother's background online. She discovered social media posts from the literacy program at the community center, photos from charity events at organizations she had never heard of, all featuring volunteers whose faces she studied carefully. And there, in a group photo from a food bank's volunteer appreciation dinner, was her mother. Lucia stood slightly apart from the others, her expression serene but somehow transformed from the woman Marina remembered. She looked fulfilled, content in a way that Marina, despite all her material advantages, had never felt. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 2 years and 3 months after Marina had told her mother to stay away from their lives. Marina was alone in the house. James had moved out the previous week after their relationship had finally collapsed entirely, when the mail arrived with what appeared to be official correspondence. The envelope bore the letterhead of Hope for Tomorrow Foundation, an organization Marina had never heard of. Inside was a formal letter of gratitude, personally addressed to her at the Whitmore family address. Dear Ms. Whitmore Santos, we hope this letter finds you well. We are writing to inform you of a remarkable act of generosity that we believe you should know about, even though the donor specifically requested complete anonymity. Your mother, Mrs. Lucia Santos, made an extraordinary donation to our foundation in the amount of $5,000 to fund educational scholarships for underprivileged children. This donation, made 18 months ago, has already transformed the lives of over 200 young people who might otherwise never have had the opportunity to pursue higher education. We are reaching out to you because Mrs. Santos recently passed away in her sleep, and our legal team discovered among her papers a sealed letter with instructions that it be sent to you in the event of her death. Marina's vision blurred as the words swam on the page. Passed away? That couldn't be right. She had just seen her mother a few weeks ago, had watched her walk confidently to her car outside the apartment building. Lucia had looked healthy, vibrant even. With shaking hands, Marina continued reading. We must clarify, there appears to have been an error in our records. We have since learned that Mrs. Santos is very much alive and well. However, the letter she left with us was dated from the time of her original donation, with specific instructions about when it should be delivered. She asked that if you ever tried to contact her through charitable organizations, which she seemed to think might happen, this letter should be sent to you immediately. We apologize for any confusion our initial wording may have caused. Please find Mrs. Santos's letter enclosed. Mrs. Santos's donation was part of a larger philanthropic initiative totaling over $6.5 million to various local charities and educational programs. We felt you should know that your mother has quietly become one of the most significant philanthropists in our city's history. With deepest respect, Dr. Patricia Mendez, Executive Director Hope for Tomorrow Foundation. Marina's hands were trembling so violently she could barely unfold the enclosed letter, written in her mother's familiar handwriting. My dearest Marina, if you are reading this, it means you have discovered what I chose to do with the money. I hope you are not reading this because something has happened to me, but rather because you were curious about the work being done in our community. 2 years ago, I inherited $7 million from your great-aunt Isabella. your grandfather's sister who went to Portugal when you were small. When I received this money, my first thought was of you, how it could secure your future, how it might bridge the gap that had opened between us. But then I realized something important. You had already decided I wasn't worthy of being part of your life based on who you thought I was. If I came to you with money, how would I ever know if you wanted me for myself or for what I could give you? Instead, I decided to use this gift to help other families avoid what happened to us. Every scholarship I fund goes to a child whose parent is working multiple jobs, sacrificing everything for their child's future. Every program I support helps people who understand what it means to struggle, to dream, to hope for something better. I am not bitter, minha filha. I am proud of what you achieved, even if I am sad about how you chose to achieve it. But I wanted you to know that the mother you were ashamed of, the woman you thought didn't fit into your world, was always worthy of respect. Not because of money, but because of the values that guided how I used it. The remaining money, about $500,000, is still yours if you want it. It sits in an account with your name on it. But I hope that if you claim it, you will understand that its real value isn't in what it can buy, but in what it represents. The love of a mother who worked her entire life to give her daughter opportunities, and who used an unexpected gift to help other families do the same. I love you, Marina. I always have and I always will. But I also love myself enough to know that I deserve better than shame and rejection from the person I sacrificed everything to support. If you want to see me, to truly see me, you know where I live. But please don't come because of the money. Come because you remember who we used to be to each other. With all my love, Mamai. Marina collapsed into the leather armchair that had cost more than her mother used to earn in 6 months. The letter clutched against her chest as sobs racked her body. $7 million. Her mother had been wealthy, genuinely wealthy, for over 2 years, and Marina had never known. While Marina had been playing society wife and slowly losing herself in a world that valued appearance over substance, Lucia had been quietly transforming their entire community. The magnitude of what she had lost was staggering. Not just the money, though, that was devastating enough. She had lost the chance to see her mother honored for her generosity, to witness the pride and fulfillment that clearly filled Lucia's life now. She had lost 2 years of watching her mother become the kind of person Marina had always admired from afar, someone who used power and resources to lift others up rather than to build walls around themselves. But most painful of all, she had lost the opportunity to learn from her mother's example. All this time, Marina had been trying to become someone worthy of the Whitmore family's approval, when she could have been learning from someone who had achieved something far more valuable: the ability to transform pain into purpose, rejection into resilience. Marina sat in her car outside her mother's apartment building for nearly an hour before finding the courage to get out. The letter was still in her hands, crumpled now from being held so tightly, but she couldn't seem to let it go. It was proof of everything she had misunderstood, everything she had thrown away in her pursuit of a life that had ultimately left her empty. The building looked different to her now, not shabby and embarrassing, but modest and dignified. Her mother had chosen to stay here not because she couldn't afford better, but because this was where she belonged, where she was connected to the community she served. Marina climbed the familiar stairs to the 3rd floor, her heart pounding with each step. When she reached the door marked 3B, she stood frozen, her hand raised to knock, paralyzed by the weight of everything she needed to say and her fear of how it might be received. Finally, she knocked, 3 soft taps that seemed to echo in the hallway like gunshots. The door opened and there was her mother. Lucia looked older, of course, but there was something else different about her. She stood straighter, carried herself with quiet dignity and confidence. Her clothes were simple but well made, her gray hair styled rather than just pulled back. Most striking were her eyes, clear and calm, with no trace of the hurt and confusion Marina remembered from their last encounter. "Marina." Lucia's voice was steady, unsurprised. "I wondered if you would come. You knew I would find out? I hoped you would. Eventually." Lucia stepped back from the doorway. "Would you like to come in?" The apartment was transformed. While still modest, everything was clean, organized, comfortable. The walls were covered with framed certificates and thank you letters from organizations Marina didn't recognize. Photos showed her mother with groups of people, at charity events, community gatherings, graduation ceremonies where she was clearly an honored guest. "I got the letter from the foundation," Marina said, her voice barely above a whisper. $7 million, Mama. $7 million, and you gave it all away." "Not all," Lucia corrected gently. "There's still money set aside for you, as I mentioned in my letter. Enough to give you genuine security, to let you make choices based on what you want rather than what you think you need." Marina shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "I don't want the money. I mean, I'm grateful, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I realized I threw away something worth more than money. I threw away my mother." Lucia moved to the small kitchen and began preparing tea, her movements calm and deliberate. "You threw away the mother you thought you knew," she said. "The poor, embarrassing woman who cleaned buildings and worked in restaurants. But that woman was always more than her circumstances, Marina. The money didn't change who I am. It just gave me the resources to show who I had always been." "I know that now." Marina's voice cracked. "I've seen the news stories. The photos, the letters on your wall. You've helped hundreds of people, maybe thousands. You've done more good with that money than most people do in entire lifetimes. And I was ashamed of you. Ashamed of the most generous, dignified woman I've ever known." Lucia set 2 cups of tea on the small table and sat across from her daughter. "Tell me about your marriage," she said quietly. The change of subject caught Marina off guard. "It's over. Has been for weeks, really. James and his family. They wanted me to be something I wasn't. Or maybe they wanted me to stop being something I was. I don't know anymore. And what do you want now?" It was such a simple question, but Marina realized she hadn't asked it of herself in years. What did she want? Not the approval of people who would never truly accept her, not the security of wealth that came with invisible chains, not the status that required her to deny her own history. "I want to know my mother," Marina said finally. "The real woman, not the caricature I created in my head. I want to understand how you took the worst thing that ever happened to you, me rejecting you, and turned it into something beautiful." "It wasn't easy," Lucia admitted. "There were nights I cried myself to sleep, mornings when I woke up and forgot for a moment that you weren't part of my life anymore. But I had 2 choices, become bitter and angry, or find a way to honor the love I still felt for you by loving others. And you chose love. I chose purpose. Love without purpose becomes obsession. Purpose without love becomes empty achievement. I needed both." They sat in silence for several minutes, sipping their tea and processing the weight of their conversation. Finally, Marina spoke again. "Can I ask you something? When you made all those donations, when you helped all those people, did you ever think about me? Did you ever imagine that I might see it? Might realize what I had lost?" Lucia smiled, the first genuine smile Marina had seen from her in years. "Every single day, every scholarship I funded, I wondered if you would have been proud. Every family I helped, I thought about ours. Every time someone thanked me, I wished it was you saying those words. I am proud, Maman. I'm so incredibly proud of what you've done. And I'm so ashamed of what I did." "Shame is only useful if it leads to change," Lucia said. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" Marina moved out of the Whitmore family estate the following week, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind the trappings of a life that had never truly belonged to her. James made the divorce proceedings as difficult as possible, but Marina found she cared less about the financial settlement than she had expected. Her mother's letter had reminded her that security came from self-respect, not from bank accounts or property deeds. The law firm where Marina worked was surprised by her request to transfer to their pro bono division, taking a significant pay cut to focus on cases involving family law and children's rights. Her colleagues couldn't understand why someone would voluntarily step away from the lucrative corporate track, but Marina found the work more fulfilling than anything she had done in years. "I want to help families stay together," she told the division head during their meeting. "Too many children grow up thinking they have to choose between success and staying connected to their roots. I want to prove that's not true." Marina also began volunteering at the Hope for Tomorrow Foundation, working directly with scholarship recipients to help them navigate the legal and administrative challenges of higher education. She never revealed her connection to the foundation's mysterious major donor, But she found deep satisfaction in seeing her mother's money translated into real opportunities for young people who reminded her of her younger self. The relationship between mother and daughter rebuilt slowly, carefully. They met for coffee once a week at first, then gradually increased their time together as trust was rebuilt on both sides. Marina learned about her mother's charitable work not as an outsider reading news reports, but as someone privileged to see the day-to-day impact of thoughtful philanthropy. "You know," Marina said during one of their weekly coffee meetings, "I used to think success meant escaping where you came from. Now I'm learning it means carrying the best parts of where you came from forward with you." Lucia reached across the table and covered Marina's hand with her own. "That's the first time in years you've sounded like the daughter I raised." "I'm trying to remember who she was. It's harder than I thought it would be." "She's still there," Lucia assured her. "She just got lost for a while in someone else's idea of who she should become." 6 months after Marina's return to her mother's life, they established a new tradition. Every month, they would visit one of the organizations that had benefited from Lucia's donations. Not as donors or board members, but as volunteers, working alongside the people whose lives had been touched by anonymous generosity. At a community center in Marina's old neighborhood, they helped families navigate college application processes. At the women's shelter, they assisted with job interview preparation. At the literacy program, they worked with adults who, like Marina's mother years before, were trying to help their children with homework despite their own educational limitations. "This is what wealth should do," Marina observed after spending a Saturday morning teaching basic computer skills to senior citizens. "It should multiply opportunities, not isolate people from each other." "Now you understand why I couldn't just give you the money," Lucia replied. "You needed to discover for yourself what makes life meaningful." 1 year after Marina received the letter from the Hope for Tomorrow Foundation, the two women stood together in the auditorium of the community college where Lucia had funded the Second Chances program for adult learners. They were attending the graduation ceremony, not as honored guests, but sitting quietly in the back, watching as 43 men and women received certificates and degrees that would transform their lives. Carmen Rodriguez, the young mother Marina's mother had met at the literacy program years earlier, was among the graduates. She walked across the stage to receive her nursing degree, her young son cheering from the audience. After the ceremony, she approached Lucia with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Santos, I know you probably don't remember me, but you changed my life. You helped me find the scholarship program. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. My son is going to grow up watching his mother work as a nurse instead of struggling just to survive. I can never thank you enough." Marina watched her mother embrace Carmen, saw the pure joy in both women's eyes, and understood finally what true wealth looked like. It wasn't about having money. It was about using whatever resources you had, financial or otherwise, to create connections, opportunities, and hope. Later that evening, as they sat in Lucia's apartment reviewing applications for a new scholarship fund Marina was helping to establish, Marina brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Mama, I need to tell you something. The money you set aside for me, I want to add it to the scholarship fund. I want to match it with my own savings and create something permanent." Lucia looked up from the papers she was reviewing. "Are you sure? That money was meant to give you security." "I am secure," Marina said, and she realized it was true. "I have work that matters, I have my mother back, and I have the chance to help other families avoid what we went through. That's worth more than any amount of money in a bank account. And if you have children someday, shouldn't you save something for them?" Marina smiled. "If I have children, the greatest gift I can give them is the example of a mother who knows the difference between having enough and having too much, who understands that love means lifting people up, not shutting them out." They worked together until late that night, planning a scholarship program that would specifically help young people from working families attend college without losing their connection to their communities. They decided to call it the Isabella Santos Memorial Fund, honoring the great aunt whose unexpected gift had made everything possible. As Marina prepared to leave that night, she paused at the door. "Mama, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret it? Giving away the money instead of using it to, I don't know, travel the world or buy a big house or live luxuriously?" Lucia considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. I've lived luxuriously every day for the past 3 years. Not because of what I owned, but because of what I was able to give. And now, having you back in my life, working beside me, this is richer than any lifestyle money could buy. Marina hugged her mother tightly. I love you, Maman. And I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that love isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. Welcome home, Minha filha, Lucia whispered. Welcome home. As Marina drove back to her modest apartment, a place she had chosen for its proximity to the community center where she now volunteered, rather than for its status address, she reflected on the journey that had brought her full circle. She had started by rejecting her mother to gain acceptance from people who had never truly valued her, and had ended by rediscovering that her mother's love and example were the only inheritance that really mattered. The surprise that had made her cry wasn't just the money her mother had given away. It was the realization of what she had almost permanently lost in her pursuit of a life that had never been worth having. But perhaps the greatest surprise was learning that it was never too late to come home, never too late to choose love over status, never too late to become the person your mother always believed you could be. In the end, Lucia Santos had given her daughter the most valuable gift of all, not money, but the wisdom to understand that true wealth comes from knowing who you are, where you come from, and how much good you can do with whatever life gives you.